Hello and thanks for visiting our website, rebuilderinabox.com. Today we're going to be rebuilding Valeo. This particular model is common on GM with the 2.2 Ecotech from 02 to 05. It includes the models Cavalier, Malibu, ALERO, and Grand Am. You'll see the two Allen head plastic rivets holding the plastic cover on. These need to be chiseled off with a screwdriver. After both heads are chiseled off with a screwdriver and a hammer, you'll see a shaft made out of plastic. It's actually just a pin with threads on it. We're going to drive it out with a brush pin. We're tapping on the brush pin with a hammer on both sides to tap that small shaft out. Then the lid comes right off. Next we have to remove the regulator by removing the three 7mm head screws that hold the regulator on. We've put yellow dots of paint so that you can find them easily. After the three screws are out, remove the voltage regulator brush holder assembly. You'll see the four outer perimeter bolts holding the two halves together. They have a 5/16 head on them. We've put yellow paint on them so you can identify them easily. Those have to be removed next. Now we're going to break the two pieces apart. Place one hand on the back half of the alternator. Take a ball peen hammer and tap 180-degree intervals. Taking the pulley off, we'll need a 1/2 inch impact and a 15/16 socket. Hold the pulley with a rag in one hand. Open the vise up so that the rotor fits down in it and put a rag on the bottom beam of the vise. Don't tighten up the jaws on the vise. Make sure that the rotor fits loosely in between the jaws. Apply your favorite brand of rust bust penetrating oil to the shaft and bearing area. Put the pulley nut back on the shaft and screw it down halfway. Lay a piece of stock 2x4 and hit it with the hammer. You need to inspect the slip ring where the brushes ride to make sure that there's no black plastic showing through the bottom of the copper. Usually there will be some wear in this area. This one is like brand new, but a lot of times there'll be somewhat of a groove, maybe a 1/16 of an inch deep, and you can usually get away with that. But if they've burnt all the way through, which is not common, but if it's burnt all the way through and you can see black plastic in the bottom, then you have to get another rotor. Take a piece of 80 grit sandpaper and polish up the copper slip ring. For rear bearing removal, first apply your favorite brand of rust bust penetrating oil. Occasionally on some alternators we'll be faced with a bearing that needs to be removed from the shaft. The tool that makes this job the easiest and a worthy investment for any shop is a Dremel. You'll be needing a reinforced cutoff wheel. The Dremel and the reinforced cutoff wheel are available at any big box store, Lowe's, Home Depot, or even a Walmart. Draw a line on the outside race of the bearing on one side, and then 180 on the other side. Draw another line. We're going to use the Dremel wheel to cut along that line. We've cut through the one side. We're going to turn it to the other side and cut the other outside half of the race. After the outer race and the balls in the cage have been removed, we need to deal with the inner race. Basically following the same procedure. One method, if you can get a grinder in there or a grinding wheel, you can grind a piece off the side so that it gets down to the shaft and it relieves the tension on the inner race. We prefer to use our Dremel for this in the same fashion. I've scribed a line and then you scribe another line on the other side 180 away from this one and use the Dremel to cut it off. After you get it most of the way cut through, the actual race itself is so brittle you can take a chisel and just hit it quickly with a hammer and it'll shatter off. If you have a little bit of collateral damage on the shaft itself or up into the rotor body, it's of no significance. As always, eye protection is a must. Next we have to remove the 4 T20 tapered head screws holding the front bearing in. These can be a little abstinent because there is some Loctite on them, but heat always defeats Loctite when you're trying to remove something. Also, if you tap straight down on them with the T20 inserted into the head of the bolt, it gives it a better bite and helps break the taper loose. Here you can see after the bolts have been removed where the red Loctite was applied at the factory. Don't make the mistake of heating up the head of the bolt. Heat up the aluminum where the red Loctite is internal. Next we're going to drive out the drive-in bearing with a 1/2 inch extension and a hammer. Put the drive-in housing in an oven and bake it for 15 minutes at 350, or heat it up with a propane torch so that it expands enough to where the bearing falls in. Reinstall the bearing cover retainer and the 4 screws with the T20 Torx head. Place the nut back on the shaft halfway and put the rotor in the vise. Tighten it up loosely, but set the nut down on the beam of the vise. Place the bearing on the shaft and use an 18mm deep well to tap the bearing on. Be careful so that the socket contacts only the inner race, not any of the rubber seal or the outer race. Take 400 grit paper or Scotch-Brite And don't sand to remove any stock, but polish up the shaft a little bit so that we can put the drive-in housing back on the rotor. And put a couple drops of oil on it and spread it around with your finger. Put the rotor shaft back in the bearing and tap it on. Notice the alignment mark in the drive-in housing and the alignment mark in the rear part of the housing. Put the 4 bolts back. There's a ground spot on the aluminum that you have to clean up with a wire toothbrush. And then put a small amount of white lithium grease. Slide the brush holder voltage regulator assembly in from the side, carefully watching that the brushes are properly installed. And then put the 3 voltage regulator screws back in where they go. You'll notice the grooves in the plastic on the voltage regulator and the grooves in the dust cover so that you can slide it back down onto the voltage regulator. Push the dust cover back down into the grooves. Use the 2 provided screws to put the cover back onto the rear plate. Put the pulley back on pretty much the opposite of the way we took it off. Push the pulley on, get the nut started, and use your 1/2 inch impact on clockwise, 15/16 socket. Put a rag around the pulley. And we're done.